the finest warriors from the finest legion. The companions hold a singular honour of service above all others. To become a companion, you must first take a wound, a death blow meant for your charge, and survive. To commemorate this act of sacrifice, a piece of armour is repainted in bone, and they may bear the arms of the inner circle. This tutorial is for infantry level miniatures and fits into army painting too, so this is perfect for intermediate to advanced level miniature painters. These miniatures are a follow-up from a Lion Commission and use the same Phosphex soaked bases used on the Primarch. The visual of a Dark Angel task force soaking the ground with Apocalypse level weaponry, weapons only housed by the First, weapons that are considered to be war crimes in this universe, in 30k, in 40k, as extreme as this is. Yep, it's an unbelievably compelling image, and one day I'll collect that force, but today is not today, because today we are going through how to paint the Dark Angel's companions. Okay, to start with, the conundrum of black armour. Now, we have dealt with this subject extensively during the tutorial courses, but for this tutorial I do want to emphasize that this is perfect for infantry level miniatures. It uses 3 colours, well 2 if you don't classify black as a colour. We undercoat our miniature with scale 75 black primer. I prefer using this because it gives a very matte surface to start building our transitions up on top of. Then I use a dark blue. In this case I'm using Deep Blue by Scale 75, but Deep Sea Blue from Vallejo is also very good, as well as Coal Black. And I'll thin this paint, the Scale 75 paint, 1 part paint to 1 part thinner. The thinner I'm using is Life Colour. I find this works with a variety of different acrylic paints, a lot easier than say a Vallejo only brand or Scale 75 only brand. I will be applying this very broadly over the armour marks. So top of the shoulder pads, top of the arm, top of the head. But what's important here is that I work quite broadly. I don't want too thin of a line. You can see how I've developed a piece earlier on, so hopefully we could get the entire unit looking like that. Next up, we are using Pale Grey Blue, and this is thinned down to a consistency of 1 part paint to 3 parts thinner. It should give you roughly the same consistency as our previous colour, but because this is a different brand, it's a different thickness, it has a different pigmentation, a different suspension medium, we do need to thin this down a little bit more, and again this is done with Life Colour thinner. So you can see the pigmentation, how thin it is. With the miniature, I can be a little bit cagey in how I apply my highlights. So you can see how I could cut across the miniature. I can cut across that knee pad, giving me a really nice sharp line sitting next to it. I'll highlight the arm. I'll highlight the top of the head, shoulder pads. It might be worth reflecting at this point just how bright that is. That doesn't look like black at all, but that's fine. Because our next stage we're applying gloss varnish, which will reduce the contrast. We will be applying oils, which will reduce the contrast again. It's worth pushing it a little bit too far at this point because we will lose so much in the transitions coming up. I'll apply 2 layers of the Pale Grey Blue. I'll make sure that all my volumes and values are in the right place, and that is it for the airbrushing stage for the black armour. So it uses 2 colours, dark blue and the light blue, built one on top of another. And that is it. All the complexity will be developed with the oil work and the brush work. The airbrush I'm using is the Custom Micron, and I'm running the airbrush at 30 psi. For the ivory, we base coat those portions that we want to be in bone with olive brown. We allow to dry, then we highlight with ivory. Unfortunately, the footage was scrambled and wasn't usable, but it will end up looking like this. It's two simple colours, one on top of another, to build up that transition. I did not mask off the area. I didn't need to. I feel like I have enough precision with my airbrush. However, simply use you can simply use blue tack, or you can use a playing card to mask it off very roughly. This stage is a little bit boring, but it's necessary, so we're blocking things in. Decayed metal is used to blocking the shoulder pads and any gold areas, and then heavy metal from scale 75 is used as a faux dry brush. Because we're building up on top of a black base coat, well, we can use that to our advantage and keep black in the absolute shadows. I've splayed out the ends of my bristles, and I'm just gently dragging undiluted silver across those portions I want to be highlighted with silver. So there are a few areas in the miniature that need to be painted in red. We will use deep red to base coat the miniature. The chapter symbol, the Legion symbol, any cross keys, any areas that you feel need to be picked out in red, we do so. Olive brown is used to pick out any further white areas or any parchment that appears on the miniature. We simply do this with a brush, just adding it on top, a single base layer. All the complexity of these tones will be developed with our oil paints. Next up, we use black green from Vallejo Model Color, the perfect Dark Angel's tone. Well, if you're a 40k Dark Angel. And this is a simple base coat. Once all that has been blocked in, we apply a layer of Vallejo gloss varnish across the entirety of the miniature. 1 or 2 layers will do the job very nicely. And it's important that we do not thin this mixture down whatsoever. If we thinned it down, we do run into some issues with it sticking. And it's just a far better medium if it's used undiluted. It's meant for airbrush use. It's been designed for airbrush use already. Okay, my secret sauce. Cobalt violet, burnt sienna, lamp black. I've since mixed up a great big vat of this stuff, and I keep it in an organic coconut butter casing, a glass. But the consistency, or rather the ratio, we have cobalt violet, 20%, lamp black, 20%, and burnt sienna, 60%. I hope that makes 100. And then Sansador thinner has been dumped in there. Ideally, we are looking for the consistency of drawing ink. So if you've ever used a fountain pen, or if you've ever used an inkwell, that's the consistency we are looking for. The secret sauce, the recipe that I've just described, is used to overlap the metallics, is used to overlap the ivory, and it is also used to overlap any metallics, so any silver that we have there, gold, silver, ivories. For the armor plate, we're using pure lamp black because we want absolute black in those shadows. And we can see, look how much we've lost in the transition, look how much contrast that we have lost. It's crazy how much we do lose. And after this stage, so we allow the oil paint to dry around an hour. You can use a hairdryer, but this is the thing I normally do at the end of a painting session. I'll come back the next day. I'll apply a matte varnish across each miniature, and for this I use Vallejo Model Color. And then we're on to the brush stage. So far we've developed the tones, we've developed the base coat. Now it's time to develop the complexity. Now I have just made a mixture using green, white, ivory and black. However, if you don't want to mix and match your own paint, simply use green grey by Vallejo Model Color. It is a very light pastel green. But once I have colours on my palette, I do like using them freely. I don't like keeping two colour recipes necessarily. I much prefer to understand the underlying theory of why I'm doing what I'm doing. For example, in this case, I'm highlighting the armour with a pinch of green to link it back to the Dark Angels of 40k, link it back to Caliban. Now, fortunately, it is a cool colour, so it fits in very nicely with the blue undertone of the armour. By spiking it with a little bit of green, we just add another interesting visual element to it. I very, very carefully add an edge highlight to the armour plates of the miniature to further clarify them, and I'll add the odd scratch here and there because I get bored during this procedure. Okay, the ivory parts are next. So we take ivory from Vallejo Model Color. Beautiful colour it is as well. And ivory, so if you were interested in colour mixing and matching, in order to create ivory, we take yellow, black and white. It's about 99% white, pinch of yellow, pinch of black. So to begin this procedure, I simply load it onto the tip of a brush. And you can see I'm using it in sort of like a stabbing motion. The detail is so dense on this miniature, it doesn't give me much room to add sweeps. So instead I'm plotting it out by dotting it. I'm using pointillism. And another thing I can do to give further texture to the miniature is drag the tip of the brush down on the feathers. And what this does is suggest individual feathers. So not only are we highlighting our miniature, but we are also adding texture. We are also adding those micro details that you only really see on big HD renditions in artwork. Because of the scale we're dealing with, we can't exactly express this. Well, we can't express it easily. But by hinting, by suggesting, by rolling the brush around in that manner, we do suggest a greater level of detail than the miniature may necessarily have. For the helmet feathers, it's exactly the same procedure. We have done all the hard lifting with the oil stage. And this really is the crux of my technique. Between airbrush work, establishing very rough tones, then adding complexity to those tones with oil paint, and then using the brush to help develop those tones. So that's the three-pronged approach. Pure ivory is used to highlight or add specular highlight, so that's a highlight that sits right at the very top of our value scale. I couldn't resist adding it to the eye. It's always a good idea to add high value contrasts or highlights onto the head to drag attention to it. I also take this time to block in the eye as well. Now there are a lot of feathers on this piece, so make sure you do take regular breaks. It's a weird thing to say in the tutorial, but it is worth bearing repeating. Because of the amount of detail, because of how hard you'll have to focus on the miniature, it's very easy to think, I'll just plow through this and make an absolute mess of it. You're making twice the amount of work for yourself when you could get up, make yourself a coffee, go pick a fight with a neighbour, and come back nice and relaxed, ready to create these feathers. For anybody who remembers the Sanguinius videos or have attempted to paint the Sanguinius from the tutorials, I think you're all having flashbacks. Okie dokie. So you can see how I splay out the ends of my bristles on my brush. This is simply ivory, but because I'm splaying out the bristles, I'm using a very, very light pressure. It doesn't really give that much of an impression. It doesn't leave a very strong brushstroke behind. So again, I'm suggesting texture. I'm breaking up the miniature visually, because there are a lot of really nice details on this miniature. So by modulating or changing up your brushstroke, you're able to suggest things about the miniature that maybe the detail doesn't quite bear out. For any trim, olive brown and a pinch of ivory is used to highlight it. I wanted sort of an off cream white rather than a pure non-metallic gold. And this does feed into the, I guess, character of the Dark Angels. I don't imagine them... I imagine them to be quite haughty, but I don't imagine them to be Emperor's Children. But on that scale, they sit somewhere around the Ultramarine scale for me. So they will certainly have all the trappings of Empire, but they won't necessarily polish their armor mid-battle. Okay, for the plasma glow effect. Oh, I've neglected this so far. So that is a base coat. Let me make sure I got my notes in correct order. Of blue-green from Vallejo Model Color. I've simply watered down ivory and I'm feeding it into the coils. I'm trying to feed the light, the illumination, right towards the bottom. The water should help the capillary action, which is just a fancy way of saying the paint should sit in the gaps. Then we allow that to dry. Again, splaying out your bristles. You can achieve such wonderful results by doing this. And don't worry if you ruin the material. So there is, or there was, I'm not sure if they're still alive, a New York cartoonist, and he had a bit of a fetish for buying new notebooks. But he had a problem because he couldn't write in them, because this notebook could contain genius. You could have given it to an Einstein. It could have been filled with lyrical poetry. So he has a stack of these books that he never used. So he got into the habit, as soon as he bought a new notebook, he'd flick to a random page and scribble on it. It's ruined forever and ready for your work. Same thing with brushes. That's where the analogy was leading. Don't be afraid to ruin a good brush, because if it serves you well, it's done its job. It's meant there to be ruined. Okay, next up I'm using black-green with a pinch of black. And unfortunately the camera has decided to... doesn't do this often, but it's annoying when it does. Focus on the scene behind it. I'm simply rolling it from the very top of the plasma coils downward. So I want the light to sit at the base and the shadows at the top. I will come back later in the painting process and add an airbrush layer of blue-green around the surface. So don't worry if it looks a little bit too bright and intimidating at this stage. It is meant to. Okay, right at the very top of the highlight, I'm taking blue-green. I'm just adding a very small pinch. Ooh. That's my computer telling me I have an appointment in half an hour. Rightio, brush stage. Antares Red from Scale 75 is used to block in the eyes, and this will also be used to highlight the Legion symbol and any red areas that we blocked in earlier on. The paint is practically undiluted because this detail, the detail on the miniature is so clustered. It is so clustered that we are unable to create large sweeps with the brush. So instead I am relying on stabbing at the miniature. A pinch of ivory has been added into the Antares red to create a light pink. I'm using this in a similar fashion, I think you've seen this before, to create those wings. On the very tips of the... I wish I knew the name for this there. I wonder if it does have a name. I mean, the Ultramarines have the Ultima symbol. Dark Angels, what is this? Anyway, okay, cloak. A really useful tutorial on how to create the folds of a cloak using nothing but the brush. So what have we done so far? We've simply added an oil wash over a base coat of black green. I'm taking black green again to build up the basic tones, the basic volumes of this cloak again. I've added a pinch of ivory into the black green. You can see with my brush stroke how I am building up those folds. I can add a nice edge highlight here to clarify the detail. But you can see at this point I'm not too concerned with the actual blend. What's of more concern to me is just building up those volumes and values. We keep coming back to this. I feel like it's a I'm not explaining myself well by keep trotting out that phrase. But what is a volume? It's the shape of the cloak. It's the shape of the miniature we're trying to express. And the values is simply the scale from black to white. By adding ivory into this, it's a little bit of a cheap way to highlight it, because later on I will be taking very, very thin down black green and applying this over the top. So the coloration doesn't change a whole heap. It's simply, I guess I'm using this technique a bit like a pre-shade, where we take a miniature, undercoat it black, add white, and then a colour on top. It's the same process, but I'm doing it with a brush instead of an airbrush. The paint is very thin at this point, and I only ever use water to thin my paint. But if you do live in a hot country, or if you find you need paint thinner, by all means use it. Anything to make our lives easier, right? I'll allow that layer to completely and utterly dry. Feel free to use a hairdryer at the stage. Then we can add another thin layer of paint. I can add a little bit of a wet blend here, just to help smooth out the transition. So I've added black green, and while the paint is still wet on the surface, I can take my highlight and drag it across. So this should feel like you're rubbing mud together when you're doing this procedure. Okay, black green is used again as a filter layer, so it's a very thin down quantity of paint. I'm dragging that over the highlights that I built up initially. And again, as the paint is still drying, I can take some of the ivory, quickly mix it in, and help blend the tones together. So, to begin with, we use layering to build up the volumes. We add a filter layer to help cool it down, and then we use another filter layer over the top, but before that dries, we take a little bit of our highlight color and blend it together. If you did want more information on brush control, I can highly recommend the Hulk paint along tutorial series, where there's a long stretch, a very, very long section on brushwork. I can also recommend a video called Cooking with Colour. It's one of my favourites to recommend to students because it breaks down the technicalities of the paintbrush and how you can apply different effects to your miniature to achieve different results. It's a really nice guide into how you manipulate your brush on certain surfaces. Alright, with that done, let's have a look at the metallics. Yes, metallics, I said that with confidence. Okay, Peridot Alchemy and Necro Gold, both from the Scale 75 range. Why do I like Scale 75? Because the metallic pigment is really ground very, very fine. So I'm able to achieve really nice blends, and I'm able to do things like washes, which you can't normally do with other... So if you try and do a wash with a Games Workshop paint, it's just not going to work. But the Vallejo Air range is excellent for this procedure. Scale 75, obviously. I can also recommend the Vallejo True Metallic color range. They come in these large boxes. Very, 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 well, very good. A little bit on the expensive side. Worth every penny. So what I'm doing here, just with Peridot Alchemy, is defining the lines of the shoulder pads and any metallic that I have. This gives a really bright, brassy, false gold appearance, which I think is appropriate for the Dark Angels. Not saying anything political there whatsoever. I'm not trying to insinuate anything. Rather, the Dark Angels are the host of secrets. They aren't the most trustworthy of legions. So instead of having a bright heroic gold with lots of yellow and orange tones that you'd normally use with Ultramarines, say, or Custodes, you can suggest a certain decrepitude of character. I'm not sure that's the right phrase. But you can certainly suggest something about their character by having this false gold appearance to the armor plate. Clip all those out. You can see now why we have a matte base tone. So the golds, the metallic pigment, really reflect and they really shine in comparison to the matte shadows. We lock the shadows in place with matte and we highlight the highlights with the metallic pigment, so it gives them the opportunity to shine. That base, that Phosphex base. Okay, this base was put together with bark that I found from a tree. Where else would you find bark? But during the summer, I like to hike it down to my local park and take bark that's fallen off the tree. I don't strip it off the trees. I don't rip trees to bits for basing material because it would harm the tree. And I want to come back next year. And we should like trees as a... I said I wouldn't get political. I know it's a very divisive thing to say, but trees are nice. Okay, the base. I've put down some polyfiller onto the base to give it that fractured appearance. And over the top of this, I'm using Vermilion from Vallejo Model Color. Now, Vallejo's great. Vermilion is great because it has this really bright fluorescent quality to it that pairs up very nicely with the pigment we'll be applying on top later on. So I'm giving a rather heavy base coat of this just to make sure it's completely and utterly covered, completely and utterly dry. Next up, I'm taking pure black. So any black that you have in your collection that runs through the airbrush, that's the black you can use. I can't remember which black I didn't use black at all, sorry, it's a grey. Eclipse grey, I'm awfully sorry, is used to highlight the stone, and it also overlaps the base. Now I'm pretty sure black comes up next. Or at least that's what's written in my notes. Come on, notes, don't fail me. Haha, yes. Okay, black is applied on top. So when we apply the fluorescent pigment later on, we have a really nice contrast with the light underneath and the black on top. Once that's all completely dry, we can take our smooshing brush, one of my favorite brushes in my collection. So it's a dry brush essentially. You can buy it from rosemaryandco.com. And with pure black, I'm adding a dry brush layer, but you can see I'm not really dragging it across the surface, I'm stabbing at the surface with the side bristles of the brush. Stab, 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 and that is a technical term in miniature painting circles or art circles. This technique is known as the stabby stab. So we stabby stab up the base, and again it's there to generate contrast between the fluorescent phosphex and this abused earth that these guys are standing on. Pinch of grey is also added to the brush. It's far too bright, so I need to remove even more. I don't want much of this on the surface. It's just there to add a few different notes. So the bark, by the way, was just simply broken up and glued on with quite a lot of super glue. I find this gives a much nicer overall appearance. I'm able to build up layers using bark than say using stones. The bark was treated in an oven for around 20 minutes, low temperature, just to make sure there are no bugs or parasites, and also hardens it up as well. But beware, it will make your oven smell like wood. Like aggressively smell like wood. Unpleasantly smell like wood. But we all knew we'd be making sacrifices when we got into this. When you signed up for the Patreon, you knew the risks. I'm also taking this opportunity as well to add a couple of layers of detailing to the armour. So right at the very top of the highlights, the fist, on top of the speckle hat. I wish I hadn't applied this. This is me complicating things. You do not need to add this whatsoever. Okay, the next magic source, Hera Miniatures Dark Red Fluorescent Pigment. I've been using a lot of this stuff on basis to suggest, well, phosphex or fire. I've also been using it in plasma fusillades in the coils, the energy coils, with great success. Okay, so water, plain old everyday water, has been applied to the base, and then I'll drop on pure pigment, and I'll gently soften this into the surroundings, and when it dries it will leave a beautiful, beautiful base behind. We seal everything with isopropyl alcohol. Just a single layer, don't drench your miniature, we don't want to strip the paint off it, it's just there to seal the pigment. Alternatively, you can use airbrush cleaner. Simply apply it on top, Bob's your uncle. I also like loading up the brush and gently blowing, so with the brush to add embers floating across the miniature. I think it gives a really nice visual to the end. And that's it. We have Dark Angel's Companions, a very easy to replicate recipe, suitable for armies, suitable for intermediate users and advanced. I hope you gained a lot from that video. Thank you so much for watching. If you were interested in more Dark Angel tutorials, we have the full Lion tutorial available right now. We also have a colour guide for infantry, more of an experimental piece. We also have a dreadnought, as a Blood Angel dreadnought, but it's a black dreadnought, so fill your boots. We also have a video dedicated to painting black armor. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you in the next video.